Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our home away from home here at the Munk Center for International Studies on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto. We are pleased to welcome you to our broadcast tonight, as well as these people in our audience who have gone to our website, tvo.org, and signed up to be here for tonight's discussion about Pak-Ghanistan. We want to let you know, those of you watching us on television right now, that you can also join us online after this broadcast ends at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Go to tvo.org. You can start to do that right now, in fact, and you can submit your questions for our guests, and we'll get to them in a live web chat after the program at 9 Eastern Time. So watch us on television now, flip over to the website afterwards, and get ready for that discussion as well. Joining us tonight to talk about Pak-Ghanistan, Yar Taraki, Executive Chairman of the Pashtun Research, Advocacy and Policy Centre of Canada. Murtaza Haider, former reporter for the Frontier Post and the News in Islamabad, Pakistan, currently with the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Tariq Fatah, founder of the Muslim Canadian Congress and author of Chasing a Mirage, The Tragic Illusion of an Islamic State. That's coming out next month. Zafar Bangash, columnist and director of the Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought. Hamid Alakozai, former advisor to Columbia University's Teachers College in Afghanistan, currently studying international relations at the University of Waterloo. And Janice Stein, TVO's own foreign affairs analyst, director of this Munk Center. And normally we don't ask for applause for our audience here, but I'm going to make an exception today because last night, Janice, in Ottawa, you won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for The Unexpected War, Canada in Kandahar, as the best Canadian political book of the year, and I think we should recognize that. Congratulations. Extra brownie points for all of your students back here who clapped, okay? Absolutely. Just to let you know. All right, for the time being, Canada's combat role in Afghanistan will continue. Is this a good thing, Tariq, for Afghanistan?
Considering what happened in the Pakistani elections and the defeat of the Islamists right across the country, especially in the Northwest Frontier province, it bodes very well because the attacks on the Canadian armed forces, the IEDs and the sabotage and minelaying that was happening from the Pakistani side of Taliban, that will start to lessen. If the new governments in the NWFP in Balochistan and in the federal government in Pakistan do what they say they are doing, there will be a lowering of tensions, and I think it bodes well. It will allow the Canadian Armed Forces to do what they can do better, which is development work, and help the Afghans develop the country.
Zafar, Canada in Afghanistan.
I think it's a wrong mission. It is an ill-defined mission. And I'm afraid unless and until the mission is defined clearly, what the objectives are, what benchmarks need to be achieved, I think it is going to lead to more disasters. And I also completely disagree with Tariq with respect to the elections in Pakistan. I think he's missing the point.
Hold off on that.
And I'll come to that. I just want to say that security is not the forte of the provincial governments over there. It's a federal matter.
Okay, let me get in here for a second because I'm going to beg you all to hold off on the elections. We are going to get to that later. I want to focus right now on the fact that we have an agreement in Ottawa at the moment between the two major parties on Canada's participation there, not only today but going forward for a few more years. And I want some feedback from all of you on whether you think that's going to bring, you know, some positive, constructive developments to the area. What do you think?
Well, I think if you have a war and you have an enemy and a well-defined enemy, for a war to end, one has to surrender. That's how all the wars have ended in the past. In this mission, we do not have a well-defined army that we are fighting. We have a ragtag army. We don't know who the enemy is. And if this war has to end, I would like to know who would surrender, what the terms of surrender would be, so that we can say we have won a war.
You're pointing out a lot of things which lead one to conclude that you don't think this is the right mission in the right place.
I think it would be a right mission if we know what we are doing. If someone could tell me that this is how this war would end, this is how the surrender would happen, or this is how long it would take for us to first identify the enemy, define it as an army, then orchestrate a surrender, and then we can say we have won the war. I don't see that happening.
Yar?
Well, thank you. I would say that there is a well-defined enemy. The enemy is poverty. The enemy is distraction. The enemy is lack of education for children, particularly for girls. And this war is a contemporary war. It's not a World War II or World War I to see who will surrender and who will be defeated. We have a mission to complete. We have to bring reconstruction to a nation who's sacrificed their 1 million population and 600 billion worth of real estate and land to bring the success to the allies against the Russians in the Cold War.
Let me get Hamid on this. Go ahead.
There is no doubt that the Afghan people, they need desperately the international community help. Without the international community help, Afghan cannot do anything. For 30 years in Afghanistan, the Afghan population, they slaughtered on the street, they lost their dignity, and there was no help from the outside. And that time when the international community, they've been to Afghanistan, all the Afghan people, they hoped that there will be a time for the Afghan people to come together and to have a good government. There is no doubt that the Afghan people, they need the international community help. But there is three things and major thing which is very sensitive. One is the lack of management. The other is the cultural sensitivities. Mm-hmm. And the other is misunderstanding and lack of trust.
Okay, let's pull apart some of these things. And Janice, I'm going to get you to comment on this first. All of us in this room know that John Manley, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister of the country, recently produced a report for the Prime Minister offering a road forward and some advice. And we'll just do a couple of the highlights of this report, and then Janice, I'll have you comment on this. Some of the Manley report highlights: more disciplined diplomatic position regarding Afghanistan and the regional players. Stay in Kandahar beyond February 2009 if our allies can provide approximately 1,000 more troops and additional helicopters and surveillance capacity. Revamp development assistance to Afghanistan to provide more assistance that addresses the immediate, practical needs of the Afghan people. A more systemic assessment of Canada's contributions to the effort in Afghanistan. And finally, the federal government should provide the public with franker and more frequent reporting on events in Afghanistan, especially in terms of development and reconstruction. That from the Manley report. Janice, if we do all of those things, will the situation in Afghanistan be more stable in your view?
There's no guarantee of success. And I think it's very, very important that Canadians understand that even if everything that the Manley report recommended were to occur, and it's a tall order, in fact, because what the Manley report demands of us is almost as much as what it demands of Afghans. It demands a reorganization at home and a major change in the way the international community does business. So these are tall orders. If all that happens, there still is no guarantee of success, partly for the reasons that you mentioned, Steve. These reasons are closely integrated. What happens in the Pashtun areas of Pakistan has an impact on the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan. They're connected. And the political future in both countries is still uncertain.
Well, let me follow up with Hamid, because you said a moment ago that you need, in Afghanistan, Western participation in order to bring some stability to the area. There has been 6 years of Western participation in trying to achieve some kind of stability in this country, and yet U.S. intelligence agencies are now reporting that 70% of the country is still beyond the control of the central government. So are more resources from the West really going to make a difference?
As I mentioned, Karzai is a very good guy, and he is a good person. He has a good heart, but there is no doubt that he has a lot of problems inside the administration.
They call him the mayor of Kabul, as opposed to the president.
In a way, yeah, in a way, absolutely. Because the Afghan people, they thought that the international community in Afghanistan, and whatever government is doing, that's the secondary sources for the international community. So the Afghan people in Afghanistan, they're thinking whatever corruption is going on in the country, that's the responsibility of the international community.
It's not.
But it's not.
Okay, Zafar
it's not.
Let me take some of the points that the Manley report mentions. You know, on February the 8th, the NATO defense ministers meeting in Vilnius, they said, in fact, General Dan McNeill said that the international community or NATO would need 400,000 troops to fight the insurgency in Afghanistan. Now, Manley says, if we get another 1,000 soldiers, we are going to be all right. I mean, there's a vast difference between 1,000 soldiers and 400,000 soldiers. And I think we need to ask, where are those 400,000 soldiers going to come from?
Murtaza,
which country in the world is going to bring those 400,000?
Are these fair questions he's asking?
These are absolutely fair questions. Right now, there are, what, 50,000 odd troops in Afghanistan, of which 25,000 are from the United States. The rest come from all over the world. And the question to ask is how many troops we need to restore security and peace in Afghanistan. You have to look at what has happened in the last 2 years. 2005, there were no suicide bombings or very sporadic events. In the past 2 years, in 2006, 130 suicide bombings. In 2007, 150 suicide bombings. The violence has increased. In 2007, more than 6,500 people, civilians, have died. Things have worsened. No one who is on ground in Afghanistan is saying that things have improved in the past 6 years.
Yar?
We didn't need one soldier to change the map, political map in the tribal areas of Pakistan and the Northwest Frontier Province. The election changed the map. The religious and conservative parties and coalitions who were supporting the extremists, they are gone. They are not supported by the population anymore. We can see the same picture in the south of Afghanistan, and we don't need even more soldiers. We need better distribution of the funds, of the aid from outside. We need a better management of the funds. We need more reconstruction.
Janice.
Yeah, I think that the discussion of the numbers of soldiers is, in fact, vastly misleading, if you'll excuse me so far. There are, in fact, 15,000 troops in the 3 southern provinces, in Kandahar, Helmand, and Oruzgan. That's all. So when you talk about those global numbers are, some of them are in the east. But if you actually look at the number of troops in the south, there are 15,000. There are probably between 18 to 20,000 Taliban. It goes up and down. We have, in fact, tragically, one of the most under-resourced missions. And this mission has been under-resourced from the word go. Will 1,000 troops make the difference? It's not enough, there's no question. But we have, in fact, the inverse ratio and have had ever since 2003. We've had an inverse ratio of what should have been there to provide security on the ground in southern Afghanistan.
Tariq.
See, this notion that the government in Kabul has control over 30% of the population. Let me suggest to you that from King Amanullah's time in the 1920s, that ratio has always been there.
That's right.
So for the naive intellectual based in Toronto and New York, dishing out papers and pushing this scenario, it's not accurate, because what they don't understand is that if in the Pakistani Pashtun areas, the Jamiat-e-Ulama-Islam, the pro-Taliban government, cannot win a seat in an election, do you expect that on the other side of an artificial border drawn by the British, suddenly everything changes? The fact is that the Taliban and some of the jihadi fighters are financed by Saudi sources. Some are influenced by Iran. But the Pashtuns of both Afghanistan and Pakistan have understood something over the last 20 years.
What's that?
Which is that Osama bin Laden and his racist view of who the Pashtuns are will not be acceptable. These people came to Pakistan and Afghanistan, misused the hospitality of the people. Imagine this man has been there 20 years. He still does not address the Pakistanis or the Afghans in their language. He issues tapes in Arabic, addresses people on the other side of the Persian Gulf, and considers the Pashtuns or the Pakistanis as the riffraff, which he can use as his gun fodder.
You know what
people are rejecting that, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Let's have a quick word from Zafar, and then I want to show some maps, because it's probably appropriate to sort of focus more on that.
I think let me come to this issue about the Jamiat-ul-Ulama Islam and so on. You know, we again come back to this issue of the Pakistani elections and its result. I'm very glad that the Jamiat-ul-Ulama Islam lost, and lost badly, strictly because if you look at the facts, their leader, who of course I totally agree is considered to be the godfather of the Taliban, but I think there's a greater history as well. The real godfather of the Taliban actually was Sir Nicholas Barrington, who was the British High Commissioner in Pakistan. He was the one who created it, and Nasirullah Babar, who was Benazir Bhutto's interior minister, he's credited with that. So I think we need to get the history right. But let me talk about the Jamiat-ul-Ulama Islam defeat. That man was thoroughly corrupt. He was totally linked with General Musharraf. And in fact, every political party in Pakistan, with the exception of the MQM, the Karachi-based party, every other party was totally discredited and lost the election. So it has nothing to do with Islam or non-Islam. In fact, Jamiat Ulama Islam was the only party. In fact, the majority of the Islamic parties boycotted the elections. They were not even participating.
Okay, let me urge everybody, just before we get a little further down the line, those of you behind me here and our guests here in the front, look at the monitors here, because Zafar, you talked history. Let's talk a little geography for a second. If we can, we're going to bring up a map of the area, and then we're going to show how complicated and confusing things are, because this line, this border, really doesn't matter all that much. Okay, there's Pakistan, Islamabad in the northeast corner. Let's continue our look. You can see all of the different colors on this map here. The Northwest Frontier Province in the yellow, and then you have the tribal areas in the orange.
We don't see anything here.
And it's not coming up on your side?
Nothing.
Let's see if we can fix that. People behind me can see it, and I'm sure the folks at home can too. Balochistan on the Pakistani border in red, and the border, you know, not that important, frankly, not that relevant, because there's so much cross-traffic, cross-travel, and a border that is very difficult to control. Janice, can you tell us why these areas are so prone to militancy and so beyond the reach of central governments?
I think it's a mistake to argue that they're prone to militancy.
No.
I think that's wrong. Again, I think we're looking at it from a very brief perspective. What they are prone to, especially the border areas, just on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border, there is traditional societies with tribal leaders that jealously guard their autonomy. And that's, I think, the crucial issue. So just as Tariq is right, that the central government, the government in Kabul, there was never an all-encompassing state that expanded into all areas and provided all services. That's the West imposing its own views. So the government of Pakistan, historically, has always allowed autonomy for these areas. The militancy, I think, is a very different issue. That militancy developed during the resistance to the Soviet Union. It was financed by the West. It continued afterwards, and it is the principal source, it is the principal strategic base today for the Taliban.
But we'll raise the question, I mean, if you want to have a solution in Afghanistan,
you have to have stable politics in Pakistan.
Is the point. You can't,
there's no question.
You got to result in, okay, good.
We have a lot of problems, but the problems has been solved. There is no problem without solution. We're supposed to look at it from different angles. As I mentioned, there is a lack of trust and lack of communication in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The territory is not today issue of today. That since the Afghanistan history and Pakistan history, people, they are living over there. And this is not just a time now that there is a lot of mistake going on and a lot of problem going on, but this time is different. In the past also there was a problem, but with different view. When people, for example, they were committing a crime in Afghanistan, they were going to that area for the refuge, to seek the refuge. Why they were returning the bad guy to the Afghan government? Because during the King Zahir time, King Zahir was for 40 years in Afghanistan. Those tribal areas, they had a great respect for him because there was interconnection with them. King Zahir was respecting them. They were respecting King Zahir.
These are gone. Murtaza, come on in.
I think the situation is very complicated. We have a very reductionist view of the way we see things, assuming that the tribes are guarding their sovereignty, and that's why. No, I think they are the indigenous people of that area, and they have been kept disenfranchised and marginalized, first by the British and then by the succeeding Pakistani governments. One of the most draconian laws ever inked in the history of mankind is called the 40 Frontier Crime Regulation, 40 FCR. Under that one law, the British and later Pakistani governments have ruled the entire tribal areas with an iron fist at the behest of one political agent who would run his own prisons. This is how we have kept the tribals in outside of the main foray in Pakistan.
Yar, you wanted to say.
Well, the Durand line, when your program started, you started from the 2,300 kilometer plus Durand line. This line was determined by a British citizen who worked for the British Army and was enforced on an Afghan prince who was a prisoner of war at that time. Since then, the British ruled. In 1935, the British India established the Northwest Frontier Province against the will of the Pashtunis. What a stupid name, Northwest Frontier. And it stays the same until today, Northwest Frontier. Is Pakistan having an Eastern Frontier Province, a Southern Frontier Province? What is NWFP? What is federally administered territory? It is all to divide Pashtuns, create havens for elements that suits the Pakistani establishment, and we know that the Pakistani philosophy is based on religious.
Okay. But Zafar, as we focus on trying to find solutions in Afghanistan, is it fair to say that that will prove to be impossible until you find solutions in this area in Pakistan? They're so interrelated.
I think this is true, yes, I will accept that. But I think, what we need to do is to understand the reality properly and not misread the reality. And this is what I'm suggesting. This is what I had said in the beginning, that these elections are not going to make that great a difference, for the simple reason that a defense policy in Pakistan is not formulated by politicians. It's formulated by the military, which is dictated to by America. That is not going to change. That's going to continue. Secondly, people who are participating in this struggle, whether on the Pakistani side or Afghanistan side, particularly Pakistani side, they're not interested in elections. They're going to continue their way of life. I just want to say one other thing with respect to Afghanistan itself. I mean, Tariq said that, well, since King Amanullah time, only 30% of the country was controlled by the federal government. But we need to keep in mind that you didn't have 10 to 12% of the country in control of an insurgency at that time. The rest of the country was at peace. Similarly, you didn't have this massive corruption that you have in Afghanistan today.
So the analogy doesn't work.
Absolutely. In fact, you look at the Human Development Index, Afghanistan in the last 5 years has declined in every category. Every category.
But that's absolutely not true.
60% of the people.
That's not true.
Janice, where is it not true?
60% of the people in Afghanistan are living below the poverty line.
Yeah, but that's not true. If you actually look at infant mortality rate, it's actually dropped significantly in the last 4 years. If you look at the number of children
what
in
would you
school,
classify as
let's have a list. Can I hear the list? Infant mortality, what else?
Infant mortality, there's been a significant drop for the first time in 25 years, actually. Maternal mortality has dropped. The number of children in schools has risen significantly in the last 4 years.
Especially girls.
The number of Afghans receiving basic health services, which means the ability to go and access we're not talking about the Canadian healthcare system
Janice,
here.
The Human Development Index is saying something completely opposite.
That's actually not true.
No,
that is not true.
There is a big achievement. We shouldn't ignore that there is no achievement. With respect, there is achievement, but as I mentioned, there is a problem.
Okay.
We're supposed to solve the problem through dialogue, through communication. Today, Pakistan and Afghanistan, they have a problem. And the problem should be solved, not just from the government level, from the civil society level, from the people, the tribal areas, people level. Yes, we shouldn't forget that. Any dialogue, any communication in any dialogue based on hypocrisy doesn't bring anything.
Murtaza, then Tariq.
I think our web viewers would be able to help us in getting the numbers right. I think Afghanistan is ranked 174th on the Human Development Index out of a total of 178 countries. That's for 2007. I could be wrong, but our web viewers should help us. Secondly, the infant mortality rate, if you look at the CIA's fact book, Afghanistan has the third most infant mortality rate, in excess of 150 children dying of 1,000 life.
But maybe it's still
It could
better.
not be any worse. This is the third worst. I mean, how much have you...
Well, it's very interesting because I just have looked at those numbers. You are right that Afghanistan is a desperately poor country, came out of a civil war, which destroyed the infrastructure and destroyed most basic services. So the numbers you're quoting are correct. But if you actually look at the infant mortality rate, it was astronomically high. It was something like between 65 and 70%. It's dropped below 50% in the last 4 years.
Tariq has been
Why?
patient.
Because people have access to health services now that they didn't have 4 years ago.
Tariq, over here,
Is it the
please.
worst? Is it the
Hang on,
fourth worst
Janice,
in
hang
the
on.
world? Yes.
Go, Tariq.
There is a stereotype which gets repeated that about militancy of the Pashtuns. I'm not a Pashtun, I'm ethnically Punjabi.
Thank God for that.
Yes. The Pashtun militancy.
Zafar, what are you?
I'm a Pashtun.
Okay. Just want everybody else to know.
Everybody should be clear on this.
Okay.
No, in Pakistan they call us Pathans. That's no problem. That's okay. In Afghanistan they call them Pashtuns, but that's okay.
Okay.
The issue is that the tradition of the Pashtun has been not one of militancy. In the last 70 to 80 years, from 1920 onwards, the number one icon of the Pashtun nationalism was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, better known to world historians as the frontier Gandhi. The man turned people away from guns, and his slogan was Muhabbat, love, dedication, and activity. And the peaceful movement that he led was crushed not by any other force but the central Pakistani government. In 1948, the elected government of the NWFP was dismissed by Mr. Jinnah. The province of the frontier province was amalgamated into a single unit. They are not allowed, the Pashtuns or the Pathans of that area, are not even allowed to name their province properly. It's governed by the military. The people are subject to racism, and the Americans are primarily responsible in bringing those militants in and feeding through the CIA, the Mujahideen, and subsequently the Taliban. So you can't blame it on the Pashtuns or the Pathans.
Yar.
Good. Well, I've heard, first of all, I would invite Zafar to pay a visit to Afghanistan to see some changes that he haven't seen. I don't think he was in Afghanistan for the last 3 decades.
Yar, when was the last time you were there?
I was in May of 2007.
So you've seen the changes that Janice refers to?
Yeah, I've seen it. I know the solution, how things could improve, but before that, everybody was right. I would agree with you that things are bad. There's a human development index below the level that we would wish for. That is why I need the international community to help. When the international community had a fight in the Cold War, Afghans came and helped them. Now we need that help. We don't want anything for granted. We need that help.
Okay. Let me talk about the elections here for a second, which I know you all were touching on earlier, and we'll get us in more discussion about that right now. In the recent elections in Pakistan, the Islamist parties were defeated, routed in some cases. Janice, will that help bring stability to the area?
Let me make it just a little more complicated, because we have a really interesting paradox.
That's what we need. We need this story to get more complicated.
More complicated. Yeah. But we have a fascinating paradox that actually has come out of the recent Pakistani elections. You have the defeat of the Islamist parties in the border areas for a paradoxical reason. Because they were seen as closely linked with Musharraf, because they were seen as associated with a strategy which sent the military to confront directly into the border areas.
Can I just stop you for a second? Because this may not make sense. They lost the election because they were seen as being close to Musharraf,
and therefore,
who's America's puppet, they claim.
Yes.
So how does that make any sense?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Our categories don't fit too neatly here, and I think it's important that we understand that. I mean, let me say it again. Islamists lost because they were seen as too closely associated with a military strategy supported by the United States. Now, what's the strategy now? And here's the interesting test, because we've talked about dialogue, right? The strategy of the Pakistan Awami League, National League, which is in fact the
ANP.
The ANP.
In the frontier provinces.
In the frontier provinces, is an interesting strategy. It's remove the military, in fact, proceed to the kind of dialogue that you're talking about, engage tribal leaders, have, in fact, traditional jirgas or councils which can spill over the border. So much of what, in fact, and don't use the military, right? Don't confront directly. And that, more than anything else, will defeat militants because there will be a restoration.
Everybody's putting their hand up. They want in here. We'll tell you first, then Zafar.
In order for someone to lose election, they have to contest elections. I'm extremely delighted that liberal forces have won in Pakistan. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Islamic forces have lost in Pakistan. The alliance of mullahs, which won large seats in 2002, wasn't there to contest. It was just one party. The primary organizational force in Pakistan that represents the right-wing mullahs is Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the most organized party, actually the only organized party in Pakistan, and that boycotted the election.
But Murtaza,
and I would hope that when the elections happen again and they contest, they lose bitterly.
Murtaza, the Jamaat-e-Islami does not run in the NWFP. The Jamaat-e-Islami strength was never there. The strength, if you look at the elections from 1948 to now, it is the Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam, both its wings, that have formed government. Mufti Mahmood formed the chief minister. The Jamaat-e-Islami won one seat in Chitral.
Tariq, help me. And therefore, the point is what?
The point is that they were defeated comprehensively. In fact, the Jamaat-e-Islami, the party that said boycott the elections, failed because the vote percentage went up from the 2002 elections. Janice is partly correct that the JUI, the Islamists, were connected with the Musharraf, but in what way? The military intelligence and the ISI, the creators of the Taliban, were always linked with the JUI. They were always there recruiting Pakistanis to send to Afghanistan to fight the war. But there were 6 parties in the Islamist alliance. Parties that were supported by Iran were defeated. Parties that were supported by Saudi Arabia got defeated.
So you're happy about all that, obviously.
And the party that won openly proclaims itself to be a secular Pashtun nationalist party. You cannot get elected by saying that we are secular and yet say the Islamists didn't lose.
Zafar.
Much has been talked about the ANP. Let's get this clarified. The ANP is on record as saying that they don't want the American forces over there. It's not only a secular, but it's a leftist party.
Absolutely.
And they are pro-Moscow, in fact. In fact, they are categorically opposed to American intervention. So anybody who's hitching their horses on the ANP are going to be sadly mistaken.
How is pro-Moscow?
Excuse me, let me finish, please.
No, I'm worried about the Moscow part.
Yeah, no, I'll come to that. Don't worry. Just wait a minute. With respect to the election itself, I think people should keep in mind that this election or these results are not going to bring any stability to Pakistan. It's in fact a hodgepodge of a result. I foresee that perhaps within less than a year's time, there will be another election because all of these, the 2 main political parties, the PPP and the Muslim League of Nawaz Sharif, etc., they are both vying for power, but I think their alliance is unstable. It will not last too long, and in fact, within a year, we might see another election.
Let me ask the bottom line question here to you. Are you confident that any Pakistani government, whether it's dominated by the civilians or dominated by the military, has the best interests of Afghanistan at heart?
There is, well, from one side, I will agree with Zafar Bangash that it may come back because Pakistan is ruled mostly by military.
Correct.
And we will see there's 2 scenarios. The ANP, is by the way, it's not a pro-Moscow. It's not a Cold War is over, by the way. And there's no...
It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
So the ANP is a moderate. They are Muslims. They are a moderate party. They win the elections not because they are moderate, because people are tired of the tyranny, because of violence, because of the extremist views that was promoted in the area. Now, there's 2 options.
But do they have good intentions towards Afghanistan?
If the ANP gets the federally administered territories included into the Northwest Frontier Province and remove this very old, outdated name and give Pashtuns to reclaim their identity, then things will go good. And to remove the Taliban making factories in the Pakistani territory. If they succeed in that, well, things will go.
Let me follow up on this.
Just one moment. Otherwise, the military will crash this movement. Maybe in 6 months, maybe you have more information, maybe in 1 year. If the military crashes this movement, we will go back to the Talibanism, we will go back to those factories, we will go back to fighting in Kandahar.
Let me put this, I know everybody wants in on this again, but I want to put another map up here because, again, it comes back to this line which was drawn so many years ago and which appears not to be terribly relevant in the affairs of things. Let's go back to the region. And we're showing in this map the overlapping Pashtun areas in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, you know, I guess broken up by the Durand line, the border. Now look at this. How do you, I guess part of the problem here is that we've got a large ethnic group that's split over 2 countries. This is not a unique situation in the world, but it is a situation that has to be dealt with here. Question I have, Janice, I'll go to you first on this. What do you do about this?
It's a very, you just said, Steve, it's not unique in the world at all. In fact, it's a very, very common problem when you have a national grouping that is divided between two states. There are hundreds and hundreds of cases like this, all through the Middle East, all through Africa, and
Should they eliminate the border? Want to create a new country?
What has to happen, and here I agree very much with Hamid, is that the dialogue has to take place between leaders on both sides of the border who share a common sense of Pashtun identity. There is not a desire for militancy among most of the Pashtun leaders themselves, and I think that's the core point. As a result of the militarization of Pakistan, as a result of the support of the Mujahideen by the West, you created, in fact, a militant movement which Pashtun leaders, traditional leaders on both sides of the border, actually do not support. The big question is, have these leaders, and this to me is an open question, I don't think we know the answer, have these leaders who have been historically important been so destabilized by 15 or 20 years of violence that we are dealing with a different set of Pashtun leaders
can I get you to speak to that?
20 years ago?
Speak to that map and how you resolve that issue of one ethnic group split over two different countries.
As I mentioned, that's not just today. This territory is from hundreds years ago, 1,000 years ago.
It was
the problem is the real problem is we're supposed to understand.
Yeah.
It's not a border.
If there is no border issue. If there was a border issue, because that's come under the international theory, border integrity and state sovereignty, which is related to the United Nations. There is a problem, misunderstanding between people. We supposed the international community, the Afghan government and the Pakistani government, they're supposed to create a peace dialogue, and they're supposed to create a peace committee between those tribal leaders. That committee will be not just for the media purposes, as they did it, and they brought the people from that area in 2006 in Kabul. They are supposed to be peace delegation between those two tribes to keep the stability in the region. That's what it's all.
Let me give Yara a quick comment on this, and then the audience wants in.
This border is not recognized by Afghanistan since the creation of Pakistan. Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India from British, in June 3rd of 1946 said, we in principle agreed to the creation of India, but the issue about the North Pashtun areas, NWFP and Balochistan, are separate due to their geographical and due to their political issues. This is an artificial border. We promote the issue of soft border crossing, the issue of complete cultural exchange if you want to defeat the extremists, if you want to defeat the cross-border, trans-border activities of the terrorists. You need to soften this border, remove all the fences, don't mind it. No Western government should fund any project that will lead to the fencing, to the mining, or to creating any posts. And this is not a border that is recognized by the Pashtuns and by Afghanistan.
Okay, we got some folks here who want to get in. Yeah. Good evening, thanks for coming. You wanted to ask.
Yeah, when the Taliban is gone, isn't there going to be another rebel force to take their place? And do you think that the Americans really intended to bring democracy to Afghanistan? That invasion,
the Taliban were never
an unnecessary war, and it's unwinnable.
You see, the Taliban were never indigenous Afghan force. They were created by the Pakistan Armed Forces. They were funded by the Americans, and they will disappear as soon as the funding disappears, and they will disappear as soon as the border governments change. And in both provinces, and especially in Balochistan, which has the longest border with southern Balochistan, that entire constituency was the members of parliament elected from there are hostile to this notion of an insurgency in Afghanistan.
Zafar wants a word.
I think obviously Tariq likes to dream, and I think he can keep on dreaming. The Taliban are not going to go anywhere. They are going to be there unless and until the situation in Afghanistan is reflective of the aspirations of all the people, because today the Pashtuns feel disenfranchised. In fact, the government in Kabul is largely dominated by the Tajiks, by the Northern Alliance, and that is also feeding the resentment of the people. In fact, today the uprising is not simply by the Taliban. In fact, there are large tribes that are involved in it. That's why you have 12 provinces of Afghanistan which are outside the control of the government, and they are in fact under the control of these tribes that are fighting these foreign forces. So they're not going to disappear. 12 provinces of Afghanistan are not going to disappear into a memory hole, much as Tariq may think about it, but I think the reality is very different.
Okay. I think this celebration of cynicism, almost as if we are desiring disaster to happen, and anything that positive comes out is a downer. I mean, if we cannot see the positive thing that came out of the Pakistani elections, what were you expecting? Would you have celebrated if the Taliban would have won in the NWFP? This is astonishing that when we make progress, we get depressed.
There are no Taliban contesting anywhere. I'm simply reflecting the reality. You have a point of view, and I told you, and I'm here to tell you that you will see probably within a year, there will be another election. This election is not going to bring stability.
Why are you praying for doomsday?
Come on. Yar, please.
I'm going to comment on that other part of the question about the Americans
yes.
who wanted to bring democracy. As an Afghan Canadian, I don't care what Americans want. What I care is that at the current point, Afghanistan has a chance to get out of the dilemma. Afghanistan is in a threshold of either joining the international community, either coming to progress, some economic progress and social progress, or going deep into the crisis of militancy, extremism that has been imported to Afghanistan and to the tribal areas from the Arab states. So this is a momentum for Afghanistan, and I want all Afghans to use this momentum, and I want the international community to help us in that regard.
And I want to go to this next question here. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this question is directed at Janice Stein. It was regarding civil society. Do you think they have a bigger, more important role to play in the solution, whether it be by creating a dialogue or helping reconstruct? And for it to be more effective, if so, do you think that the nature of the mission has to change?
It's very interesting because actually we started to talk very briefly about civil society and haven't really had a chance to talk about it, so it's an important question. It depends what you mean by civil society, and it depends what part of Afghanistan you're talking about. Kabul, I think, is one story, which has quite a, historically, for the last really 70 years, has quite a diverse civil society. When you actually look at southern Kandahar, for instance, you're looking at a far more traditional leadership that still exists in this part of Afghanistan. And I think one of the fundamental bedeviling issues of the mission, so-called, which is really the West in its dealings with Afghanistan, is how relevant are our values? You use the word democracy. I don't think the word democracy is a core issue here. I think the real word is governance. And in southern Afghanistan, if your choice is a separate school for girls and a separate school for boys, or no school, because a school for girls and boys is not acceptable to tribal leaders, that's a different conversation than most people in the West are having about Afghanistan. So my answer to you would be, we have to see Afghanistan through Afghan eyes, not through our own.
I think the second part of your question, should the nature of the mission change, I would like to briefly address that. To throw in some numbers, our imports from Afghanistan, that is Canadian imports from Afghanistan, are less than $1 million. And our exports to Afghanistan are to the tune of $7 million. So we have got a huge trade imbalance with Afghanistan. At the same time, we are throwing in about $170 million a year to the tune of $1.2 billion until 2011. That money, that's $1.2 billion, is mostly grant money. My idea is, my aspirations are that instead of giving them charity, we should focus on building Afghanistan's economy. We should try to see how can Canada give some market space. $700,000 of imports from Afghanistan is a joke. Why can't we commit $100 million of imports from Afghanistan so that we can have some factories, some jobs? The only way to defeat Taliban is to create jobs and have people employed. In abject poverty, you create menaces that you cannot control. Canada's role could be better by creating jobs, by creating employment opportunities. Enterprises. We consume $400 billion of retail goods in Canada alone. Why not we can consume 100 million from Afghanistan?
You know, just to jump in for a moment, that's one of the real issues that Canadians have to think about much more seriously. What does our aid program look like? Why, in fact, do we not have a lending institution which goes beyond microfinance and does the kind of thing you're talking about in a serious way, enables southern Afghanis who are entrepreneurial, who are extremely hardworking and desperate for any kind of economic opportunity. We don't have the vehicles in this country to enable that kind of process. That's one of the issues that the Manley report was getting at.
Back here, please.
Yeah, the question I had was regarding the tribal system in Pakistan. A lot of the discussion was predicated on the success of the system. But what we've seen is that 100 tribal elders have been murdered in the past year or so. The new movement just shows that the tribal system has just collapsed on itself. The candidates from the tribal areas for the National Assembly, all of them got permission from Baitullah Masood. And these new leaders are just younger Taliban, like Baitullah Masood, I think, is in his early 30s. So how do you resolve this issue? Because that system, the whole system of Fatah and everything has totally collapsed.
How do you resolve what issue?
The system of the issue of the collapse of the tribal areas, because a lot of the discussion is predicated upon talking to those leaders. Okay. And those leaders are presumably...
Let me get Tariq on this. Go ahead, Tariq.
The point is that unless these federally administrated tribal areas are amalgamated into the province of the NWFP, this is not going to... That area does not have a provincial government. It doesn't have a municipal government. It doesn't have school boards. And that entire area of a few million people is kept away to avoid the imbalance of a heavy Pashtun majority in the NWFP assembly. And for the last 60 years, they've been patronized by... A double game has been played against the Pashtuns. They've been divided into two areas. Exactly. And that entire area has been stereotyped as if they are some people who are not really human, who are tribal, who exist on fighting, and that myth has been created. The moment you merge these two areas together, rename the province as Pakhtunkhwa, which the province has asked, you will suddenly have a qualitative improvement, and governance will come to those areas.
Responsible body.
Yeah, responsible body will be there. People will have some accountability. Right now, a single governor rules that area from Islamabad, and literally like a fiefdom.
It's like a viceroy.
Viceroy, yeah.
Zafar?
You see, I think with respect to the tribal areas, I think it is certainly, I would support the idea that if they were to be incorporated into the provincial administration, that would be good, but I'm afraid that is not a realistic option. What is really going to work is, in fact, greater autonomy to those border areas or to their tribal areas, and equip them with some of the things that they really desperately need. I want to address the question that he raised with respect to these tribal elders being killed and so on. And I think we need to be very careful that we do not lump all of these areas as one homogeneous whole. For instance, there are 3 specific areas where there are very serious problems in the frontier region. You have in Dir and Swat. These are, in fact, thugs, basically thugs that are being fought against by the Pakistani military, and people are actually grabbing these people and handing them over to the military. But when you come to the area of Dara Adam Khail and Kohat, the area where I came from, these are actually the Taliban supporters, because they see the Pakistan army ferrying equipment, military equipment, through that region into Afghanistan. And so if they say, you're going to target our people, that's why they hit the Kohat tunnel, linking Dara Adam Khail with the city of Kohat. And the general, who was, in fact, the commander of Kohat division, was killed in a helicopter crash on February the 6th. Then you have the Waziristan area, which is, in fact, controlled by Pakistani Taliban. They're not Afghan Taliban, they're Pakistani Taliban. So these are 3 separate areas. We need to be very careful when you talk about it. You can't just sort of generalize and say that all of them are just one area and there is just one tailor-made solution to them. Particularly in Waziristan, I'm afraid the issue is that when the people of Waziristan started to be hit by American missiles and Pakistani army helicopters and so on, that is when they started to hit back. Nobody likes to be hit back and destroyed and killed.
Can I have Murtaza, please?
Very briefly, see, our friends from Afghanistan have made it very clear that Afghanistan doesn't recognize the Pak-Afghan border. And that would be the key issue of amalgamating the tribal areas into Pakistan. If the neighbor to the west is not recognizing the border, incorporating that tribal area into Pakistan would not be possible. And that is primarily the reason why federally administered tribal areas have remained as tribal areas, because Afghanistan has not yet recognized the border. If Afghanistan recognized the border, the next step would be to amalgamate.
No, but
and the second point
is what is stopping with the border area.
The second
there is a problem because the terrorists crossing from Pakistan and just not doing the activities in Afghanistan, they are doing it in Islamabad too.
But
this is a problem not just for the Afghan people. This is the problem also for the Pakistani people.
I'm not
so
denying
Pakistan people should consider that's the national issue for them. Therefore, the solution, if we are going and talk about the problem, yes, as we mentioned, we have a problem. We're supposed to find the solution for that. The solution is Washington, London, supposed to bring the civil leader of Pakistan and also the military leader of Pakistan and the security forces and sit them together for their own sake of the national security in Pakistan.
Okay, Hamid, stand by. We're going to try and sneak one more question in here, okay, because we're almost out of time. Go ahead, please.
If NATO actually exited Afghanistan, what are the likely scenarios that would occur for either Pakistan or Afghanistan?
That's an interesting question. Go ahead, Zafar.
In fact, I think the longer NATO stays in Afghanistan, the greater the threat to NATO's own disintegration. In fact, the Americans have been pushing the Germans to send their troops from Kabul and send them to the southern parts of Afghanistan. And the Germans have flatly refused. In fact, the Spaniards, the Italians, they are all categorically opposed to sending their forces over there.
But that's not the question. The question is what happens to Afghanistan.
Yes, of course. I'm coming to that. Just wait a minute. If NATO forces were to get out of Afghanistan, the Afghans would be able to solve their own problems. I'm afraid this is foreign interference that has exacerbated the problem in Afghanistan over the last 6 or 7 years. I just want to say that foreign forces are not going to, foreign governments are not going to solve your problems.
Yes, Janice, please.
Actually, it's a very interesting question because what you hear in Afghanistan when you travel, both in the south and certainly in the Kabul area, the north and the west, is exactly what you heard tonight. Afghans do not want the international community to withdraw. There is no question. It's widespread. There is fear that the Taliban would retake Kandahar, which is the historic capital of Afghanistan, and that once they retook Kandahar, they would in fact be in a position to reignite the civil war, which was devastating for Afghans. So that does not mean they support the current NATO strategy, that they do not wish to see fundamental changes in the mission. They do.
But they don't want the troops going home
But they do not want the troops to leave. And survey after survey after survey of Afghans.
And the Afghan people just hope, and they had a hope, and they have hope for the international community. For example, before the international community to go to Afghanistan, Afghanistan had a 7-year civil war. What was the responsibility of the neighboring countries to do in Afghanistan and to bring a peace to the Afghan people? All the neighbor countries, they were supporting different groups. So the only international community can bring help with the good dialogue and communication states, the neighbor states.
Let me give Yar the last word. 30 seconds, Yar, then we got to go.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that I have no fear about the Taliban. Actually, I don't know why there's such a fear in the Western world. I don't Taliban the biggest threat for Afghanistan. They are a threat, and there is another threat of warlords, people who are empowered during this international activities. So I'm also cautious about the warlord problems. I think that NATO and the international community contribution is not an invasion, and we have to get the maximum positive results from this for Afghan population.
Okay, stand by, everybody. I want to thank everybody for participating in the televised portion of our broadcast tonight.